Before we officially begin the second session, I should atone for an omission. I neglected to thank the California Rare Book School in my opening remarks, which is housed here at UCLA. Susan Ellen is the director, and they put on every year a series of week-long seminars. You'll be hearing more about them, having to do with some aspect of manuscript production, culture, consumption, and also early printed books, rare books, that sort of thing. So they have a website, they have brochures that will show up at some point, and they were very instrumental in putting this on. So I believe that at this point we are ready to move on to structures after that very exciting and jam-packed and educational first session. Thank you, Evyn.
Thank you, Luke. Yeah, apologies, it's all going to be jam-packed. It's just the nature of the beast, but I hope you all are benefiting. So, okay, so our second session, in the first part, we'll cover structures. And then in the second part of this session, we will talk about bindings. Okay? So, book structures and commonly counted again in Islamic manuscript cultures. And we're going to carefully discuss the structure of the Codex itself, the components, how to assess their arrangement. So with that, we're talking about something called collation formulas, that sort of thing, in case any of you may be familiar with that already. So book structures beyond the Codex. What do we typically encounter? Well, we encounter rolls or scrolls, and these typically open vertically in a format that we call a rotulus. This is in contrast to a volumen, which opens this way, if you're familiar with the Torah. So significantly longer than it is wide. And the text tends to be arranged across the width and then down the length. But you often have very creative arrangements, often involving a sort of shapely arrangement of text, different scripts, text up and down, just a real wide arrangement when it comes to these scrolls. Here's an example from Michigan. Composite, so one portion of this is from the 14th century, and one portion, as you'll see, is from much later, probably the 18th century. So it has this charming case. With an oilcloth inside. This is how it came. And this actually has some traces of hooks for attachment so that it could have been hung. So this is the reverse. You can actually get a sense of the piecing, some repairs that have been done here by looking at the reverse. Okay, and then we start. So this is, is there anybody familiar with Seal of Prophecy? We have this portion of the scroll continue, and then we're going to reach a point where we transition to this much earlier portion. So here you're getting a sense of the variety that we can see in terms of the arrangement of text and so forth. But as you can see, significantly longer than it is wide. And this is pretty standard. Now this is fairly large in size. It's about this wide. After we sort of, you're getting the psychedelic sort of experience of this, but the context for these tends to be copies of the Quran, amulets or talismans, which is actually what we have in the example that we were just looking at. Silsila namelar, so genealogical charts. There's another example of that in the Michigan collection if you're interested. Excuse me. Almanacs or calendars known as ruzname that are used to determine prayer times, and those are the typical sorts of texts or works that we encounter in these rolls. And again, often quite small, possible to wear on the body, again, especially for the amulets, talismans, around the neck or to hang from standards. With copies of the Quran, they tend to be a bit larger, but again, similar sort of protective talismanic purpose. So beyond the roll, we also encounter the concertina or accordion format. This is panels which are hinged together in a format that opens like an accordion, hence the name. And this is mainly used for albums of calligraphy. So that's, it may be, this is an Ottoman calligraphic album, supposedly in the hand of Sheikh Hamdallah, which is really significant. But in any case, this is an Ottoman format for such a Morocco or calligraphic album, but you might encounter in a slightly different format within the Persianate context. But again, to display calligraphy and decorative book arts, that tends to be what the accordion or concertina format is utilized for. Another variation on the codex itself is an assemblage of loose leaf sheets. So not simply unsewn, but even the bifolia are detached, and then it's housed in, it can be housed in a wrapper, which is, this is an example in the photograph here on the far right of a copy of the Quran from sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, this is probably from the Borno area. Very common, this loose leaf format is very common in sub-Saharan Africa. So another variation on the codex is the octagonal format, which is sewn, it is bound, but tends to be in a tiny miniature format. So this is an example here. It has this case is a later sort of association, but tiny. This is this large, very, very small. And so the octagonal format tends to be in miniature. Another format that is a variation on the codex, just another sort of type of codex, is something we call agenda. So in that case, the vertical dimension is much greater than the horizontal dimension. It's basically tall and skinny. Again, these miniature copies tend to be for sort of talismanic protective purposes. They can easily be worn on the body or attached to, standards, and they're referred to as, excuse me, sancak kuramlara or sancak Quran in Turkish. All right, so those are some other structures that we encounter kind of beyond the codex or expanding on the codex. When it comes to the components of a codex, the text block is one. Okay, by text block, we mean this composition of gatherings or quires. These are interchangeable terms, okay? I tend to use gatherings, but you're gonna see quires very often in writing, and so just want you to be familiar with both terms. And these are gatherings or quires of writing material. So typically each quire is a nest, we've already talked about this, folded by folia or single folios with stubs that are stitched to the fold. And what I mean by single folios with stubs stitched to the fold, so if you have single folio, you need a stub coming off of it so that you have a fold that you can stitch through. So these are not going to be even, but you can combine them and you still have something to stitch through to combine and compose the quire. Does that make sense? So this part is a stub. That's what we're referring to as a stub. So one component of a codex, the text block. Another is the sewing. So this is typically, for the context of these Islamic manuscript cultures, this is typically an unsupported link stitch. So that means it's not sewn over cords of any kind or supports of any kind. Usually the thread is silk, linen, or cotton. Silk is quite common, actually. And on 2 or 4 sewing stations. By that we mean the number of places the thread enters and exits the folds in the course of the sewing. So Here's an example of sewing on 2 stations. So here and here, okay? You're gonna see other examples too, but that 2 is perhaps the most common encountered, but you also encounter 4. And that tends to be for larger formats, just a little more security. But of course, you can also entirely, you can encounter something that's entirely unsewn or unbound. And here's an example. This is in a pouch. I'm just going to show you. So these are unsewn gatherings that you aren't going to be able to tell necessarily by just looking at these images, but they're nested, they're grouped together, kept together in this pouch. So I don't know if you can tell that this is a pouch, but this bit at the top lifts out, and then the gatherings, the whole coalescence of gatherings is actually slipped inside, kind of a slipcase, but more pouch-like than slipcase. It's not as sturdy as a slipcase. Sometimes we encounter gatherings that are sewn individually. Each individual gathering is sewn by itself, and then it's placed in a pouch or a wrapper. This manuscript is an example of that. You don't get a good view from a digital surrogate of that, unfortunately. I wasn't involved in the design of the of the imaging for these. So you can't really get a good sense, but that's an excellent example. And if you're interested, I can send you photos. Otherwise, I have other photos, better photos that actually show what I'm talking about. So each individual gathering is sewn of itself, and then that stack of loose with respect to each other gatherings is set into a wrapper, which basically, you'll see, it looks like it's in a similar sort of format, typical cover, but it is not attached to the text block. That's why we refer to it as a wrapper. The other component is the cover, okay? So typically the cover is covered boards. So here this is my cutaway model. So you can see here's just the boards themselves in contrast to the portion of the board that's been covered with leather. So these are covered boards, often pasteboard, fiber boards, attached and stabilized by in-band stitching. So the in-bands are this portion, okay? They tend to be woven onto a core. Usually a chevron pattern is what you encounter, and they're woven over these warp threads. And so that's the primary warp threads or in-band stitching that we're referring to. That actually tends to pass through a spine lining. It's part of the attachment of the cover to the book. The cover material is affixed to the spine, so it's not glued directly onto the exposed folds of the gatherings. There's a spine lining there that's actually pasted to, but it is what we call tight back. If I do this to this poor model, you can see that there's no gap or opening that would appear in the context of what we'd call a hollow back, where that spine material is not affixed. So that tends to be what we encounter in, again, these contexts of Islamic manuscript production. So when it comes to the composition of the quires themselves, or the gatherings, so with parchment quires, we want to note the sequence of hair and flesh sides. We want to note the presence of a stub, the center of a gathering, and a missing folio, if any happens to be there. So in that analysis, we can come up with a simplified collation formula, which might not feel simple, just because it's very long. And that's the collation formula actually for this manuscript, which is one of 2 gatherings preserved in the manuscript collection at Michigan that happens to be fairly coherent and retain its sewing. So we can kind of page through. Eventually, we might get to it. You're seeing some stubs here. And it may be that you may be able to see sewing or you may not be able to see sewing. I think in this second, yeah, gathering. There it is. So that's the center. And you can see the thread kind of hanging on for dear life. Sorry. So in the collation formula, what we're representing, the V is representing, it's a characterization of the quire, the gathering, in terms of how many folios it has. V represents quaternion, which means 5 bifolia or 10 folios. Okay, 5 bifolia, V, Roman numeral V. And then H and F are standing for hair and flesh side. And we're indicating whether hair and flesh, so H1 is going to be the opening recto, and then, the reverse of that. And so what you're interested in is particularly whether or not hair, we talked about this earlier, hair and flesh, when you have an opening, are hair and flesh facing each other? Or do you have flesh, flesh, or hair, hair? So here we have the center of the gathering. This is the only place where you're going to see hair, hair, or flesh, flesh, because for the most part, it tends to be contrasting, where you'll have hair on one side and flesh on the other. Flesh facing hair. And this is in contrast to something called Gregory's rule, which you often encounter in other parchment codices from other manuscript traditions. And this suggests actually that the sheets of parchment were cut and stacked rather than folded to achieve the desired dimensions. And so that's pretty interesting. We do see this composition in early Syriac manuscripts as well. And we also have this method of stacking and cutting used for papyrus and, a little bit later in some certain contexts for paper too. So it's an interesting approach as opposed to folding the parchment in order to achieve the size, actually just cutting it down and then nesting it, stacking it, nesting it, folding it, stitching. Okay, so that's parchment quires. Paper quires. Most commonly encountered types are the quinions and the quaternions. The quinions, and I may have misspoken earlier, I can't remember now. Quinion is 5 or 10. So if I misspoke earlier, forgive me. Quinion, again, is quite common, particularly in, we're going to get to this in a second, in the Arab context. Quaternions we encounter in Persianic contexts more often. So this is 5 bifolia, equating to 10 folios or 20 pages. A quaternion is comprised of 8 folios, 4 bifolia, and 16 pages. So in the other sorts of quires that we encounter are sinions or sexternions, which would be a nest of 6 bifolia, 12 folios, or ternions, 3 bifolia, binions, 2 bifolia, and a single bifolium, which is what we were just looking at earlier, where you just have one. So quires with odd numbers. Sorry, Michael, did you have a question?
Okay, this is a bad question, but is it one of those?
Oh, that's an interesting, no, a kurras. Okay, yeah, or kurrasa. Okay, so juz'a, I mean, at different times, maybe slightly earlier, you could have an indication of the term juz'a being used for this. But usually the term that we encounter is kurras. Thank you for the question. So quires that have odd numbers of folios are irregular. We call them irregular. And that's indicative of either a lacuna or a missing folio, or maybe a situation like the opening gathering or the closing gathering, where you have to accommodate slightly different situation, maybe decoration or just kind of concluding the text, or fitting the text within essentially the paper stock that you have at hand. Okay, so sometimes you have these irregular gatherings at the opening and close of the volume. So sometimes that'll mean a missing folio, or sometimes it'll mean that one folio has been added to, say, a ternion or a binion, something like that. Now, in some cases, you have the same type of gathering used throughout the codex, very consistent. In some cases, the arrangement alternates, which is really odd to encounter, but you do encounter it occasionally. And in others, it will be completely inconsistent, sometimes even incoherent. They must have just been working from what they had. They're trying to finish their stash or their supply, and that's what they happen to already have prepared, into hand. Now, we do have systems for maintaining the order of these gatherings or quires. So again, and this is we're mainly talking about the context of the use of paper at this point. So one is catchwords. So catchwords are so ubiquitous. I don't have a linked example here because any number of these that we looked at would potentially have them. And I may be able to show you from something that we already have open here. It so happens that we don't in that example, at least not in that particular area of the volume. Let's go deep within this one and see what we find. Yes. That is a catchword. Okay, so that's what we call a catchword. And where the purpose of a catchword is to ensure, again, proper order. So the catchword that is there in the lower margin on the verso of the preceding folio should match the opening word of the opening line of the following recto. So this should match that opening word if they're in the proper order. Okay. If they don't match, then you have a question to ask. Is something missing? Are they out of order? Etc. So that's the point of catchwords. In this context, we typically have these not just for at the end of each gathering or the end of each quire, which if you're familiar with printing, that may be something that's familiar to you. But in this case, every verso is pretty much marked this way. And each folio, we're trying to keep each folio in order, not just keep the quires in order. Now, foliation is the numbering of each folio or leaf, and that usually appears in the upper outer corner of the recto. So in this example, above the Arabic numerals are Hindu Arabic numerals, and those are numbering, in this particular volume, they're numbering folios rather than numbering pages. The Arabic numerals there in pencil are actually numbering pages. But that's where the foliation typically appears. It doesn't tend to appear like in the bottom, in the lower margin center, or sometimes you'll find it in the upper margin center. It's pretty much all the time in the upper margin, but usually it's in the outer corner. And that just counts the number of folios. Fairly common to encounter, particularly in, say, the Ottoman period. Pagination is the numbering of each page. Again, you will also encounter that, but it tends to be in the later period, and almost always you encounter it in the upper outer corners. When it comes to quire signatures, and I should say all of this is handwritten. All of this, none of this is stamped or printed in any way. It tends to all be handwritten. Quire signatures or numbering. So these may be numerals, maybe full words or abbreviations that appear usually on the outer corner, upper outer corner of the first recto of each quire. And this is for purpose of keeping the quires in order. And it's quite interesting when you have the context of an unbound or unsewn manuscript, not that that's what this is. You're getting to see a lot else as we look through here. That it's pretty vital to distinguish each gathering or quire. There we go. So the little red mark up there, it says kaf for kuras, and then it has a thani, the second. So that's one kind of quire numbering. But again, when you have these quires where they're unsewn, they can be distributed for copying. You want to be able to return them to their order and ensure that you have all of them in place. And so it's particularly valuable. We have this unsewn or unbound situation, but we find it for others as well. So that's to keep the quires in order. there's another example here that you can look at. And I've linked each of these links goes first to the catalog record so that you can see what you're dealing with. Typically, you're going to find information like this in this very generic note, which is actually a history provenance note. It just happens to be poorly displayed in this catalog. And it's in here that you would find reference, you know, to the potentially to any, you know, quire numbering or that sort of thing. But you can always use Control F and try to get a sense of what you're looking at. And I'm not seeing now, did I? Yeah, quire signatures numbering happens to be mentioned in Collation too. That's actually another probably more reasonable place also to be looking for this. So this is where you have, interestingly, they use the word Ras al-Kurras, and then the numeral too, instead of writing a thani. So another place to look for that information. And then you can go from here, follow this link to actually look at the images of the thing and see what that looks like in the virtual flesh. Okay, middle of the quire marks. Has anyone heard of this or encountered this before? So these are marks that actually help you sort of quickly visually distinguish that you're at the center of a quire without having to be able to see the sewing. Sometimes you have a very tightly bound codex, you know, very tight gutter, we say, and you can't be quite sure if the sewing is there or not, but you have these marks that tend to be in outer opposite corners, maybe upper right, lower left, that may be oblique strokes in, say, like almost looks like graphite or a gray ink. Or in this case, what we have is this round form that looks like hamza or khamsa. So that mark is actually a middle of the quire mark. So that is meant to be marking the middle of the quire in this particular. And you can see the sewing right here. So it's on two stations. And then something else called Bat Hindiya, which is it basically looks like a numeral 2. Go to Gachic to understand more about what that means. We don't have the time to go into great detail, but that is also something that's used as a middle of the quire mark. And again, Gachic has a whole lemma or entry in the Vademecum that discusses these various kinds of middle of the quire marks that you encounter. But if you search in the Michigan catalog, middle of the quire or middle of the quire marks, you'll see a lot of them. When you start looking for these things, you begin to see a lot of them. Just have to be looking. Okay, collation. So it's important to distinguish that in this context, what we mean by collation is the process of establishing the sequence of gatherings or quires. Okay, the same term is also used, especially in the medieval context, for the process of establishing the correct transmission, where you carefully compare the manuscript copy with the exemplar from which it was copied. And I mean, I say medieval period, but that also continues throughout the manuscript age. That process of checking or correcting is also referred to as collation. And Arabic terms for it, if you've encountered these, are muqabala. For example, that's one very common term. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the process of establishing the sequence of the quires. That's the same, unfortunately, the same word is used. So to do this, you want to check the catchwords, see if there's any mismatch, any disorder, any missing leaves. Again, just because they don't match doesn't mean you have a folio missing. It may just mean that they're just in a really bad state of disarray. Maybe the codex was repaired and care wasn't taken to properly order before it was restitched or pasted otherwise. So just something to attend to. It's not automatically suggest missing leaves, but might just mean disorder. The next step is to look for the centers of the quires, so the signs of that are the sewing or these middle of the quire marks, the fold if you don't have sewing. And then you want to count the number of folios center to center. So you start at the beginning of the book, you page through until you find one center, and then you hold that and keep going until you find, obviously more gentle than this, till you get to the next center, and you count the number of folios between them. And then on that basis, you're establishing what is representative in each one. Obviously, you need to look on either side of that to be able to kind of complete your analysis, but that's sort of where you start. And then you represent that with a collation formula. So in this type of collation formula, the lowercase Roman numeral refers to fly leaves or number of fly leaves. And then you have 3 times whatever type of quire it is. In this case, Roman numeral 6 means a sexternian or a Sinian. So that's why our count at that point, 3 times 12 is 36. Plus the following is actually a quaternion. So 8 plus 36 is 44. And then we have a binion. So that's 4 more. And then we conclude with a flyleaf. Okay? Obviously, it can get more complicated than that. That's a relatively small volume. This volume of 411 folios is a little hairier, but you tend to have these stretches of one type of quire or another. So these, you see in this second example, you see these stretches of quinions, and here and there kind of broken up with a quaternion or a sexternion, or there's an irregular quinion with a folio added to it. And then there's that long stretch of 14 quinions, you know, et cetera. Does that make sense? Yeah, Linda.
For this irregularity, is it haphazard?
It isn't necessarily haphazard. So again, sometimes it has to do with the paper stock that you're dealing with. So what's available to you again. Sometimes it has to do with trying to accommodate the text, fit the text. Like maybe you calculated fairly well, but maybe you made a certain mistake at one point that you had to correct, you know, something in your transcription. So maybe you're trying to address that. But very often when you have these irregularities, I think it's more indicative of the paper stock that you're working with and just what you had accessible to you, that you're just trying to make use of an economic use of what you have. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because more often than not, they were pretty careful about estimating what they would need based on the length of the text, the number of lines per page. Sometimes though, what they're doing is they're just emulating the exemplar, the model from which they were copying. And if that model, the Ussel it's often called, was funky, then their version may be funky as well. Okay, so there are a few trends. Again, we can only approach this fairly superficially at this stage, but in the reading, you can go a little bit deeper with this. Certain composition can suggest geography or a particular manuscript culture. So for example, quinions, and I alluded to this earlier, are the most commonly encountered type in Arab areas. And for Arabic manuscripts across periods, so even if you have an Arabic manuscript produced outside of the Arab world, then often it will be in this composition or this arrangement of quinions, as far as the gatherings are concerned. Quaternations, not quaternations, quaternions. I'll just go ahead and correct that right now. For your benefit, quaternions, that's pretty hilarious, are scarcely encountered apart from the Ottoman era modeling of Iranian exemplars. As far as in the Arab areas, you don't really encounter quaternions in the Arab areas except Ottoman era, and where you have sort of like very much a possibly even excuse me, not necessarily even in regional production, but some sort of, you know, cultural center, which is modeling more from Istanbul, where you would have manuscripts being produced that are modeling Iranian exemplars, and especially Persian manuscripts. So copies of Persian texts produced by the Ottomans, in a direct sort of emulation of the Iranian exemplar. Does that make sense? So that might be produced in, what are we talking about? Like a copy of a Persian work, Diwan of Hafez, that was actually produced in Baghdad. That's an example of what we're talking about. Or in Istanbul, or, which is not an Arab area, but you get the idea. Quaternions are the most commonly encountered type in the Iranian world, in other Persianate areas, particularly by the 15th and the 16th centuries, and for Persian manuscripts produced elsewhere, as I also mentioned. So if you have an Ottoman era Persian manuscript that's being produced in, say, Istanbul or in Baghdad or elsewhere in Cairo, then it would often be produced in this way using quaternions. In the 14th century in the Iranian world, though, you have both quaternions and quinions being used. So it isn't that, so how to say, so quaternions and quinions both were often being used in the Iranian world, but in the Arab world, it's just exceptionally rare overall to find quaternions, unless you have a Persian work. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and here's some reading mainly from Desroches. And then again, go back to Adam Gacek for each of these ideas. You'll find a whole entry on each of these to help explain and detail examples and that sort of thing. And you'll also find, you can do a search on each of these and find examples in the catalog at Michigan. Okay, bindings. So, also dear to my heart. So we're going to give an overview of bindings and then address structure and format, which we've already talked about a little bit, the materials often used, finishing, and later interventions like repair or recovering, which are especially interesting to me. And this is an image from a Mughal area. Many of you will recognize this. The Gulshan album, recognize this folio. I'm sure you're very familiar. It has these figures around in the marginal decoration, which are performing various aspects of book craft, including this binder who is stamping a binding. You can see he has bits of a cover laying down beside him, and he has what looks like a lamp back there. Okay, so binding provides protection and coherence for the book. It stabilizes it for long-term consultation and use. And it's comprised of structural elements. We have meaning, sort of the sewing, the components of the gatherings, etc., the cover, and then its attachment. How is the cover attached to the text block? And each of those involves materials and techniques that you can characterize, that you can, describe in a particular way. And then you have these possibilities of ornament, or what we call finishing. And then, there's the possibility of later intervention or repair. Most often repair. Sometimes in terms of later intervention, what we have is something I've called recovering, where you're actually, say, taking a otherwise a leather-bound book that may be in a state of disarray or not, and you're applying, say, a textile overcover to it, but not one that's meant to be like a slip cover, but one that is physically pasted down over the leather. And there are a number of possible motivations for that, including transition and ownership, or to unite the volumes of an otherwise disparate sort of set to make them all sort of look similar. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the binding. These structural elements cover attachment, materials and techniques involved, ornament, possibly or not, and then any kind of later intervention. So you are going to see a great deal of variation. That's something I can't emphasize enough across these manuscript cultures, but there will be some commonalities. Bindings are really challenging for codicological study, though, as you might imagine, or not. They are not often independently dated, okay? So that can make it very tricky to identify dated and localized exemplars when you can't be quite certain of the date to begin with for the binding. Covers are easily detached and replaced and repaired and even reused, transitioned from one book to another. Many particularly fine covers from earlier areas were preserved and reused on later codices. So you'll have a codex, you have a codex transcribed in the text block itself. The text is actually copied in, say, the 18th century, but they applied a cover to it maybe from the 14th century that had been prized and preserved and was much loved and valued. And so that mismatch can be tricky. You might say, how can you tell that that cover was from the 14th century? Well, there again are certain ways, mainly in terms of ornament, where you're fairly confident that that binding is original to that transcript. Or you maybe have some other information from, say, the documentation of the atelier, or an inspection notice, or another kind of inventory notice, or a note that actually describes repair. And so you're able to say, okay, this is 14th century. This was made in this particular workshop, in this particular place, etc. But otherwise, it can be really tricky. We do have a limited body of data like that, and so on that basis, we kind of tentatively associate particular decorative styles and so forth with particular areas, and more confidently. I mean, there's no reason to pretend that we don't have good knowledge of the output of certain ateliers. But in any case, we rarely have the signature of the binder. So it's very rare that, except again in these exceptional kind of workshop environments, where we know who's doing the binding or have done that particular binding. But we do occasionally encounter epigraphic stamps that actually identify the work as a particular binder's work, and that gets incorporated into the finishing, into the ornament. You may be able to, if you have a famous binder, you may be able to date based on their activity, and usually that requires turning to external sources. You might have some other internal evidence I've already alluded to, where you have like restoration, description of a restoration effort. Sometimes you'll have the binder identified in the colophon. That's a little bit rare, but sometimes does happen. And so you just have to take all of that into account. Okay, here are sort of standard elements of the binding. This is a very famous diagram that's been reproduced again and again and again. It comes from the catalog of Gulnarbash and colleagues, produced for Chicago, 1981. And it's giving you some sort of basic terminology that tends to be used. Foredge, tail, head, as far as the text block is concerned. You have the end bands, what we tend to call upper cover and lower cover, foredge flap, envelope flap, doublure, which tends to be used, that's for the inner lining of the board, and that tends to be used when it's decorative. Otherwise, we might call it a board lining. And then you have spine lining. You get a sense of where the spine linings and the hinges, the joints, that sort of thing are. So that's something to return to. Okay, common features. These are common features across Islamic manuscript cultures. So the Codex format, that's very common. It tends to be the preferred format. You see those slight variations that we've already seen. We have maybe an octagonal format, miniature, or an agenda, or this unsewn situation, or only partially sewn situation. But on the whole, the Codex is the preferred. Then this unsupported link stitch sewing on 2 stations or 4 stations. Again, usually the 4 stations is because you have a larger book. That's pretty typical. The woven indbands that are usually in this chevron pattern, that is quite typical, and usually those are worked on the book, so they're woven on the book, and then they're typically integral to the cover attachment. That's another typical or common feature. The fact that the cover material is somehow affixed to the spine, again, usually almost always over the spine linings, that of course is a situation we can refer to as a tight back. That is also almost always what you encounter until you get into later periods. And and then a cover that is typically flush with the text block. So no squares, if you're familiar with squares, so where you have the extension of the board a little bit, that's something we call, squares. No squares, it's almost always flush. And if you have a mismatch, that might be a sign of a reused cover or a recycled cover. Okay, so that's something actually to attend to in when you see a mismatch and it's not flush. I always like to point out the exceptions. So in the 19th century in particular, we do see sewing on supports, on usually recessed supports where there's incisions made into the folds to receive cords and then sewing over those cords. And that's in particular something we encounter in Iran in the 19th century. So it's not only unsupported link stitch, but that is pretty typical, especially for earlier periods. Okay, some other variations as far as that we could see. So with structural elements, something called a box binding or not. We're gonna elucidate that in a moment. Does it have a flap or not? Okay. Are the covers in the text block flush or not? Is it a two-piece binding or not? Sewn gatherings or not? Number of sewing stations, in bands, attachment, a little bit more on the format, etc. Okay, then we can also see variation in materials. So the paper, which is used to face the boards, most often that's what we're talking about. Covering, we're talking about board coverings primarily when we're talking about materials here. So is that paper decorative? Is it marbled, for example, stamped, block stamped? Can you see waste incorporated into that, usually as pasteboard layers? We'll see an example in a second. Do we have leather as a covering material? Do we have textile as a covering material? I think we'll see an example of that in the third session. Do we have lacquer work? Here. We're going to see some other examples, don't worry. Metal is also used, attested. I don't have good images of that at this point, but there is a silver binding preserved at Michigan. Threads and the materials used for the threads are also something we attend to. So we're dealing with silk, linen, or cotton. And again, very often we're dealing with silk, and after that, linen, and then occasionally cotton. We can also see variation in ornament or finishing. So there are different techniques that can be used. So tooling, the distinction I tend to make between tooling and stamping is that stamping is a pre-composed decoration that can be applied in one motion, whereas tooling is built up from smaller design elements to produce a larger design. Does that make sense? Then you have filigree appliqué, where you're cutting the leather and placing it over a ground silk paper, usually colored paper, etc. You have painting, or even painting in various shades of gold over the leather, different designs, or lacquer work, of course, where you have a painted composition that's covered with this lacquer-like material. Other variation, of course, there are also things like onlays, inlays, etc., that can be a part of each of these things, but it's getting a little bit, it's not into the weeds for some of you. I know that's very interesting, but composition of the ornament is something that can vary, of course. So the different motifs, do we have animal, vegetal, human figures, scenes, what colors are involved, the material. So do we have gold used? And then here I have mentioned the onlays and inlays, which are often pieces of paper or other colors of leather to, again, add some contrast and some interest. And then, of course, you can see variation in interventions or manipulations. And this is what I was alluding to before with repairs, different kinds of repairs, recovering, and so forth. So here's a sampling of some of the types that you encounter. So this box binding is the one on the far left in the image right there. That tends to only be used in the very early period and primarily for copies of the Quran, which are on parchment. Okay, and very early is relative. This is something that you will see in Desroches' typology. He calls type 1. So if you see anything about type 1, this is what's being referenced, this kind of box binding. There are excellent studies, particularly by Ursula Dreipolz and Marco Di Bella on this particular structure. And Marco teaches a workshop in which, well, he has taught a workshop in which he instructs in reproductions of this type. He's also studied the transition from the box binding to other formats. The next sort of basic, these are very basic types again, is having a flap. So that's the one in the next, where you have what's called an envelope flap, which is this part, and then this foredge flap, which covers the foredge. Now, flaps are attested in other binding traditions. Is anyone familiar with Armenian manuscript culture, Armenian bindings? Yeah, so some Armenian bindings will have flaps as well. But usually just foredge, not with an extending envelope flap. That's pretty distinctive, actually, for the Islamic traditions. And here again, I have, all of these are linked, so you can look at samples of these. And as we have time, we will, but without flap, one on the far right, again, still flush, no squares, but it doesn't have a flap. We might as well look at this one because this also has epigraphic stamps that carry the signature of the binder. This is actually a massive book. It's something that digitization completely sort of erases, is this relative size. But you can see it has, yeah, actually you can't see, sorry. Here's the lower cover. It has no flap. And there are no traces of it having had a flap. Now, where the epigraphic stamps show up are in these so-called pendants. Okay, and those have inscriptions that actually have the signature of the binder. Okay, so just having no flap, that's the distinction. And really, Desroches tries to go into some other elements of distinction, but the ultimate distinction between what he calls type 2 and what he calls type 3 is really just whether or not it has a flap or not. Two-piece binding, and I have some examples here. Two-piece binding is a situation where you have the elements of the covering material extending as flanges from each board that overlap at the spine. So there's one piece for the lower board and one piece for the upper board, and they're in two pieces overlapping over the spine. And usually a really good way to observe this is you'll see a seam where the flanges don't quite cover one another. One is a little bit shorter than the other, or sometimes the adhesive will have failed, and so one flange is like completely flapping off, or it's starting to lift. And this is actually used extensively, Ottoman and Iranian contexts. And until it was Christine Rose is the first person I know to have published this. And once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. But until you know to look for it, you know, you don't see it. Wrapper bindings. So this is again an example of the situation where, if you can imagine, say, that all these gatherings actually aren't attached to this book, but they're still nested in what otherwise would look like a typical cover that might be called a case. You know, so they're set into this, just what would otherwise be a detached case, and that's that. But there's no attachment between the text block and the cover, and that's why we call it a wrapper. And then a pouch, again, for the unsewn gatherings. We've already seen that. So that's just a sampling of different types. And again, this is a very loose classification that Desroches proposed, again, almost 20 years ago, that has since been elaborated more carefully by Karin Schepper, conservator at Leiden. Okay, so here's a sampling of some materials. So pasteboards tend to be used for the boards themselves, and that means layers of paper, usually they're pasted together. I want to show you, sometimes you can actually see the layers and discern. We're lucky that the connection is so fast. You can actually see the layers, and very often it's manuscript waste or sometimes printed waste, but more often manuscript waste for this context that's been used for those pasteboards. So layers of discarded folios that are pasted together to make up a pasteboard that's then covered with the material face and maybe edge the boards. You get the idea. So sometimes you can see that through loss or damage. I know this British Museum sticker is so obnoxious, isn't it? But sometimes you can see delamination at the board corners. That's a clue that you're dealing with pasteboards. And then other times, there's an example in the Michigan collection. I have a photograph that's really dramatic, and I didn't want to frighten you. The entire pasteboard has, the adhesive has completely failed. I don't know what they were using. And each individual leaf within is slightly separated from the previous. So it's, I mean, damage is incredibly instructive, actually. When we are respectful and very careful, we can actually learn a great deal from damage. So the manuscript that's in that situation is in this photograph. And I'm sorry that you can't see. You don't get the full effect of the delamination, but it's pretty dramatic. Okay. Leather is an incredibly common material, primarily used for covering the boards. Another type of leather treatment is shagreen. Has anyone encountered that? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? It looks like pebbling. And so sometimes you have just a treatment to the leather. And this is particularly prominent in the Iranian context. So sometimes you have treatment of the leather, and sometimes it's actually an exotic skin, like a ray skin, meaning this animal that lives in the sea. Stingray, yes. Thank you. Or a shark skin. But it's less often an actual exotic skin than this other leather treatment that gives the leather this pebbled appearance. Okay. Oh, sorry. Then we have, and actually, give me just a second because I want you to see that. Let me see because that manuscript had not been digitized. Here we go. Oh, you need to see this. So this is what it looks like. I don't know if you can tell if we were to zoom in, but it has this pebbled looking appearance. Again, you get to see sort of the extent of the digital or not, but there you can see it. Okay, do you see the pebbling? what looks like pebbling? Okay, so that's what we're talking about, and it's very often gray like this. Okay, so we can refer to that as shagreen. You will also see like a pistachio green color for this. And actually this other book, where was, it's unfortunate that it loads in the same page. So this edging, this board edging, you'll see it in a moment. Again, we're very lucky that the connection is so fast. is what I'm talking about with this kind of pistachio green color that has, again, this pebbled appearance. Can you see that? Okay, so that's also a typical kind of the color for the shagreen on leather treatment like this. This book that's actually 286, hasn't been digitized because it's very tightly bound and fat, as you can see. Framed binding or frame binding or frame cover, you'll find used in terminology and standard dictionaries and so forth. With marble paper or silk or velvet. You can look at all of these later, but here's an example with a cut velvet. And so we would say faced with this velvet textile and then edged in leather. So you have one material for the board facing and then you have another material used for the edging, usually. Sometimes you'll have the same material, like here's a case where you have silk and silk, but different silks. Oh dear, is that one not digitized either? So it's also visible in this photograph on the table here. Not very helpful. But actually, I'm surprised. But let me find another example of that one for you before I share the slides. So sometimes you'll have the same material used, but more often it's some material and leather. Marbled paper is very common to encounter in this context. And so typically you'll have the facing marbled paper and then edging in leather. So here's an example. Okay, occasionally you'll have a reused cover, recycled cover. One clue that you're dealing with that, you may have a mismatch in boards. You may have a mismatch as far as the text block versus the cover where they're not flush. This is a case where upper board looks like this and the lower looks like this. So they've taken and reused another board that was already decorated, finished as a repair. Okay. And then lacquer work, which we have a couple of examples here on the table. And there are lovely examples. There are lovely examples in this collection and lovely examples preserved in the Michigan collection. This is an example. These are particularly, superb and very popular in the Qajar period. Okay, so that's a sampling of the different materials that we encounter. And then finishing techniques. So tooling, we have gold tooling and we have what we call blind tooling. So here's an example. We just looked at this actually, but blind tooling. And then gold tooling, we have gold sort of within the recesses of what you've tooled. This is an example of that. Okay, then block pressing, where you use a cut wooden block to impress the leather. This is actually also another gold tooled, partly gold tooled, partly blind tooled binding. Difficult to see there, but this, that's block pressed. That's very common for Mamluk doublures. Then different stamping of different kinds of compositions. So very often what they were using was this suite, the Ottomans in particular elaborated this form. There's often be a central almond shape or mandorla, Desroches likes to call it, pendants above and below, and then corner pieces, and each of these are separate stamps. So you can stamp each of these, and you can rotate your corner stamp and use it, in 4 different spots, and use the same pendant, etc. And then, you may have different motifs, like an animal motif. This is an example of a bird that will also be carried over into the doublure. So here's the bird in this composition, a crane, it looks like. And then you have birds also in this filigree. Filigree applique is very commonly used for doublures. Yes, for text too. Yes, occasionally. Cut work for use for text. Which is remarkable, like how that is done. Okay, we've already seen the binder signature. Now, a large panel stamp is something that is really interesting, and some of you may have encountered this. This is where you have a whole half of the composition that's actually set into a stamp already composed. So here's the seam. This is all one stamp, and then you just flip it, and you can use it for the lower half of the board. Okay, and you get this sense because that is pretty much the only seam that you see. So these large panel stamps. Again, particularly a lot of this, especially with the filigree applique, these large panel stamps, and similar applications we see, especially in the Timurid era. Okay, the filigree applique, we already saw that example, and painting and lacquer work we've already seen. I don't want to take too much time. Okay, interventions, different kinds of interventions. So this is, in the image, is a favorite of mine because it's so subtle. So there's a repair here to the foredge flap, which is the bit in the center. And also that they repaired the edges of the text block. And they tooled the leather in a nice, complementary color. This is another shade of gold, again, that they were using. But the design that they used for the tooling is different. And you don't see it unless you look right up. Sorry, what am I doing here? Okay. Right up here. So if you see this transition from this rope or chain design, it's referred to in Turkish, to here where you have this kind of inked key design, that's where you can see it. And otherwise you don't see it. But here you can see that it extends all the way around because they also, this is the flap. So they didn't, I'm sorry. Whoa, that was weird. I didn't realize this was a touch screen. So they did not repair the edges of the envelope flap, but they did repair the edges of the board. And so here it's completely obscured because the edge here is also done. But here, fortunately, they did not. And so we were able to tell, again, that this was a repair. There's some other examples here. I just want to show you quickly an example of a covering, an overcup, kind of a recovering that was done. So you can see the impression of a stamp here in the leather that's underneath. And this was just covered over with this red book cloth and given these dull paste downs. Okay, so that's some sampling there, and here's some reading on that topic. And here is a sampling of bindings. We have some very nice lacquer represented here. We have an example of stamping. This is more from Iranian. This is more characteristic of the Iranian approach to the central ornament and pendants. And then we have a nice doublure in that example. So if you want to take a look at those.